Hello guys, welcome to a new episode of Teen Talks. Today with Professor Keen, where he's an economist where he changed and reshaped what we think about economics. His book of Debunking Economics criticizes the core assumptions of Neoclassical. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, Professor Keen, I just want to say, what distinguishes your approach from the mainstream of economics?
Well, in one word, realism. The vision that you're taught at school and universities, and it's still the dominant economic approach in all policy circles in the world these days, was devised in the 19th century. And it was actually, in some ways it began as a reaction to Marx. So it was an anti a philosophy that criticized capitalism, and this is saying no, capitalism is a great system, and it's a great system because it brings about equilibrium between consumers and producers, and that equilibrium maximizes utility, it gives you maximum profits but minimizes the costs, etc., etc. It's an optimization system. That's the way it's described. Since that was first dreamt up, people have then tried to build up what's the backstory behind the demand curve and the supply curve. What's the backstory for equilibrium? And in every last case, the mathematics did not work. Okay? You got results, for example, in the area of demand. You're told how you can derive an individual's demand curve, demand curve for bananas, for example. And then it's simply a question of adding up all the individuals to get the market demand. That is not true. The mathematics failed. It was not possible to derive a market demand curve that looked like an individual demand curve. And the reason for this is emissions in the theory, leaving out, for example, the distribution of income. So the way they define a consumer doesn't take into account that one consumer is wealthy and another one's poor. Okay? When you take that into account and there's relationships between those people, you can no longer get the results they like. Now, what they should have done at that stage, it doesn't work. We need a more realistic theory than this. But the conclusions of the theory were so appealing that people stuck to it despite the fact that they couldn't actually reach the final results they wanted to. Yeah. So only in the 20th century have we developed technologies that let us understand complex systems, not simple additive systems, but systems with complex feedbacks between one unit and another. And that's the approach to economics that I take. It still describes capitalism as as a vibrant social system, but it's got a completely different reason as to why it's a vibrant social system. Yeah. And that's, we need to get a realistic version to economics through, but we're fighting against this vision of capitalism being a perfect system. It's not. It's a complex system. Yeah. And that is just too hard for most people to make that change. It's almost like you're asking people to go from being believers in God to agnostics. Okay? Yeah. It's a huge change and most people can't do it. So this obsolete theory has persisted. It should have been shut down almost a century ago. And I'm trying to get rid of it, but it is incredibly resistant to change.
And since you're criticizing that much, if you needed to reshape how economics is taught, like high schoolers or undergraduate, and you could redesign it all, where would you begin?
I'd start with what's called system dynamics. And that's a technology developed in the 1950s by engineers at Massachusetts Institute of Technology to get rid of the crazy assumption of ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus says, let's take this little bit of the system and then assume that nothing else changes around it. That's absolutely false. If you change part of a system, of course it had feedbacks to the rest. Now in the 19th century, that meant you simply couldn't do any analysis because you didn't have any way to take into account how the rest of the system shifts when a small part of it changes. From the given computer technology, and this is obviously a conference celebrating computer technology, we've been able to do that for 70 years now. But economists have resisted it. I literally know virtually every economist who uses system dynamics on the planet. There's about 50 of them. Okay? It's ridiculously small, and the majority are using equilibrium thinking, which we should have abandoned 70 years ago. Yeah. So I'd start from the idea of a complex system, show students how to build systems that way, computer simulations, using, for example, my Ravel software to do that, make it live and vibrant and start from that point of view, and then build the economic analysis up from that perspective.
And just moving away from this part of like the neoclassical, you also predicted the 2008 crisis.
Yeah.
What were the indicators that gives like a signs of a new crisis?
simply the things that the mainstream theory ignores. So neoclassical economics ignores the banking system. That might sound crazy. It might sound like I've said an outrageously wrong thing. They're models of how money is created and how banks operate. Basically say the government controls money creation, and all the banks do is enable individuals to lend to other individuals. Okay. So that says the banking system is passive in that sense.
Yeah.
They do their macroeconomic models. They do not include banks or private debt or money in their models. So this is something which people think economists are experts on those topics. They actually dreamt up reasons in the 19th century not to consider any of them, and they still do it now. So I look at the level of credit, and I've proven, not just asserted, I've proven that credit, which is the annual change in private debt, is part of both aggregate demand and aggregate income. Okay? So if somebody uses their credit card to go shopping with you, okay, the increase in debt becomes your increase in demand and their increase in income.
Yeah.
So it's tied together. So I was looking at credit and the level of private debt. They completely ignore both those indicators. Private debt in America in the 1950 was about 50% of GDP, and the change in debt was 2 or 3% of GDP. By 2007, it was 170% of GDP,
Wow.
and the change in debt that year, which was credit-based demand, was 15%. Now that was financing the subprime bubble, of course. When the mortgages started to crash and people were going bankrupt and couldn't service their debt and so on, you went from credit being plus 15% of GDP in 2007 to minus 5% in 2009.
Yeah.
That's a 20% of GDP turnaround in credit-based demand. That's what caused the crisis. I was looking for that. I expected it. I didn't believe how large it had got to be, so I realised I had to warn about the crisis before it happened. But the mainstream completely ignored credit, and they're still ignoring it today because it's not part of their intellectual perspective.
And about the AI movement, that's growing, you think it's gonna kind of ruin economics or be like a good tool that we can use for automation?
I think we're going to ruin the ecology before AI ruins us. But one thing which is inevitable with AI, if we actually didn't face the ecological crunch that I think we do face, AI would mean you no longer need unskilled labour. Okay, because with robotics at some point, you can replace with humanoid robots, with the delicate hand movements that robots are now becoming capable of, you can replace virtually any unskilled job. So all the unskilled labour goes. With AI, a huge amount of clerical style, intellectual work can also be replaced. If you do that, something like 70% of the workforce can no longer get a job. Now, in that situation, you have two choices. Do you let them starve and end up in the Hunger Games? Or do you provide a universal basic income so everybody gets enough to stay alive? And then if you want to become wealthy, you've got to be an entrepreneur, but at least you provide a basic level of income for everybody. So if we do go to a robotics world, if it is going to be a decent world for humanity, it has to be a world for the vast majority of people. Their basic costs of living are covered by a government-created money system, with the robotics actually then producing the goods and services we consume. But then if you want to be elite, well, you've got to contribute new ideas like rockets to Mars and stuff like that. So yes, it's a major point of transformation in human existence, because from my point of view, what we have done in our economies is exploit labour, exploit energy. Okay? We used to exploit energy in the form of slaves, and then animals, then energy in the form of fuel. Now we're going to energy in the form of solar power and hopefully nuclear at some point. It's the transformation of energy into useful work that gave us our sophisticated economies. The ultimate objective should be we all can live like in Star Trek, with the replicators creating goods and services and so on. That's the trajectory we're on. If we get there, then that is a great outcome for humanity, and AI could be part of that. But you have to be aware that once you do it, you can no longer say, if you're going to be a worker, you've got to earn a wage. Well, you can't earn a wage if there are no jobs. So it is a major transformation of the nature of capitalism if we get to it. But I think climate change is going to destroy us before we get there.
And do you have I know you're not like a climate change person, but do you have any economic policy that could solve climate change?
The main economic policy to solve emissions is to get rid of economists. because the reason that we get people like Bill Gates coming out and trivializing the dangers now, and Bjorn Lomborg rubbishing climate change, saying it doesn't really matter, is extremely bad work done by economists like William Nordhaus. The guy got the Nobel Prize for work on climate change in 2018, literally assumed that a roof will protect you from climate change. Okay? And the attitude that climate change, only industries exposed to the weather, are going to be affected by climate change. That's the mentality that the economists who worked on climate change have done. Whereas again, this is going back to the system dynamics idea, 70 years ago, or 50 years ago, those engineers at MIT produced a report called Limits to Growth. And looking at the trends in the physical world from 1900 to 1970, they then ran those trends forward for another 130 years to 2100. And in every single simulation bar one, they predicted a breakdown of civilization this year, running out of resources, excessive pollution, collapsing food production, health issues, all that sort of stuff coming forward. The only way we had avoided it was by a drastic reduction in waste production, a drastic reduction in the amount of material needed to produce output, a stabilization of human population from 1975.
Yeah.
Okay. We didn't do it because economists said, don't worry, it's only trivial. The engineers were far more correct than the economists are. So we're going to hit the crunch that the engineers predicted sometime in the next, if we're lucky, 1 or 2 decades. I think at that point, it's going to be a question of whether human civilization survives. It's no longer a case of growth in the future. We should have changed direction 50 years ago. It's now a question, can we survive?
And just as a parting question, what do you give, people that are starting their economic degree? What would first advice would be? Well,
first advice I'd do is get a copy of Debunking Economics. I don't care if you steal it. You don't have to pay me money for it, because what I did in that book was, I'm a bit like you. I was 18 years old, going to university, seriously believed economic theory, was convinced that it was correct. And then in first year, I had a brilliant lecturer point out one of the flaws in the theory. And that was, I just dived in to say, why was I not taught this by the textbook? And then I found the textbooks were they not even saying they knew they were lying, but they were lying about the foundations of the theory. And I then dived in and studied it deeply. I've read thousands of articles by the mainstream and other critics as well. And I distilled it into that book to say, do not be conned by economists. So don't take what the tragedy is. This is one reason why we disrespect experts these days. Because if you learn from a physicist or an engineer or even a historian, you've got somebody who's an expert on that area. Economists, with this obsession from the 19th century about seeing capitalism as a perfect system that leads to equilibrium, which is all they could imagine back in the 19th century, that's what's undermined our respect for experts, because the economy hasn't turned out the way they said it was going to, and they were regarded as the experts. So I think a huge part of the disrespect for experts these days comes out of economics being a failed discipline that should have been, this particular approach to economics should have been shut down a century ago. So get hold of Debunking Economics. That will give you the background to show why what you're being taught by a lecturer does not apply, but there are alternatives, and that comes from the systems engineering system that I'm now working on.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For your time. Thank you so much for your advice. Guys, see you next time. And this is Teen Talks. Bye-bye.